My name is Darren Lamb. I'm the head of maths at GL Assessment, and I'd like to welcome everyone to the webinar this morning. This is the third in a series of reading webinars to provide you with key practical insights and to support you in your schools, trusts and localities. Today's session concentrates on two themes: place-based change and also addressing the language deficit. In the first part, Graeme Duncan, the Chief Executive of Right to Succeed, a charity that works to deliver educational change in areas of poverty, will explain how data can be used to effect place-based change, particularly in the areas of literacy, social, emotional and mental health. Right to Succeed have been working closely with Blackpool Key Stage 3 literacy projects since 2018. The second part of the webinar, Lisa Ling, Director of Secondaries at Whole Education, and also representatives from Bolton, will share how a language acquisition project led by Bolton Learning Partnership is leading to improvements in students' reading outcomes, both in individual and across the member secondary schools. We will hear the insights from Alison Cowan from Smithhill School, Carolyn Wood from St Joseph's RC High, Claire Doherty from Harper Green School. I'd like to thank everyone for presenting today and sharing their insights. We hope you find it useful. I'm now going to pass over to Graeme.
Thank you, Darren. Good morning, everybody. My name's Graeme Duncan. I'm from a charity called Right to Succeed. I'm here very much as the follow-up act to the brilliant webinar recently given by Stephen Tierney and Bernie Kay. Stephen chairs this Key Stage 3 literacy project in Blackpool, and Bernie is one of the leads within a school called South Shore Academy that have driven some quite significant change in a relatively short space of time. If you haven't listened to that webinar yet, we'll get the link sent out as part of the follow-up to this, but I'd really recommend it. They particularly went through what this has meant for them and for the system in general. Today, I'm here to talk about actually the theory behind whole place-based change and projects like this, and to also give a very kind of real view of what applying that theory has meant in this Blackpool Key Stage 3 literacy project. Very quickly, I'll do an introduction to Right to Succeed and who we are as a charity, a brief history of place-based change work, and then go into depth on the conditions required, both in theory and the reality of what we're seeing on the ground in Blackpool. And I'll also highlight some of the key learnings from the practice that we've seen. And later on, we'll move on to a Q&A. So without further ado, I will move us on to an introduction to the charity. So we're a charity founded in 2015. We focused on place-based change around children's outcomes. And we look at working in two particular ways. One is to overcome a major educational issue across a whole district or local authority. So tight scope, like this project in Blackpool, looking at literacy and in particular reading to begin with. And then looking at that across a whole district or local authority. And we also look at whole place-based change around children's outcomes, looking at cradle to career in far smaller geographies, and typically the size of 1 to 2 geographical wards. We do this by focusing on 3 key pillars, one of which we're going to really focus on quite closely today. First of all, how do we create and maintain the conditions required for a collective impact across an entire place? Secondly, how do we start to focus all the partners on the capability, well-being and connectivity to opportunity of the children and young people in that place, so we start to overcome some of the symptoms of disadvantage that we typically see? And 3, how do we deliver great implementation of intervention and change, and how does that start to become the norm in the place? So a brief history of place-based change as a concept is actually pretty ancient, but it has a very bloody past. It generally involved an empire coming in to bring civilization, including our own empire, I should say, to far-flung places across the world, changing their culture, their language, their religion very often as well. These days, it is far more civil, of course. It requires consent and no weapons, as you can imagine. But the theory behind it has been growing quite rapidly since a seminal piece in 2011 by John Kania and Mark Kramer. And I think it's worth spending a bit of time looking at this title, actually, that they wrote back in 2011. Large-scale social change requires broad cross-sector coordination, yet the social sector remains focused on the isolated interventions of individual organisations. That was written in 2011, and I think that's probably feeling more true than ever today. We have become incredibly obsessed with what works and what works alone. And actually, I think intuitively, we all understand that it's not just about the what, it's also the who, the how, the why that have to be right if we're going to deliver real impact. The way I always think of the what is essentially that is a tool in a toolbox that you might use to deliver change, but actually you need to deliver you need to also develop master craftsmen who know when to use that tools, how and why to use that tool. And so for me, then we need to have a broader focus than just what works alone and start to understand the how, the why and the who. That piece of work in 2011 considered what effective place-based change projects looked like and what they had in common. And it came to the conclusion that there were 5 kind of common conditions of effective place-based working, now known as the collective impact conditions. So those conditions are a common agenda, a shared measurement framework, mutually reinforcing activities that are starting to add up to the delivery of the common agenda, continuous communication, which is not just sharing success, but also trying to understand where things haven't been quite as successful and what we might have learned from it. And what does the backbone support look like? What does the structure look like that keeps the whole thing together and moving in the same direction? It's becoming a bit of a global place-based methodology that's being used very well in countries like Canada and Australia. We need to pay particular attention to countries like Canada because culturally and economically, they're very similar to our own. But over the last 20 years, they've managed to halve the child poverty rate whilst we've stayed mainly static. So we need to start to understand what countries like that are doing differently to us that is delivering such incredible change in poverty outcomes. This kind of approach is currently less prevalent in the UK, but we're really seeing a growth in demand. And I think COVID-19 has really shown that when things go seriously wrong, we all start to default to more collective working. The silos have been broken down. Schools have played a magnificent role in coordinating the response around things like food, with services like social services, etc., kind of working very closely with them in a lot of places. And I think we understand innately that when things really go badly, that's what we default to. So actually, why aren't we taking that culture more generally into the way we tackle some of the issues around disadvantage and poverty? So let's focus a little bit more on these individual conditions and understand what the theory tells us and what in practice it's looked like in this Blackpool literacy project in particular. So the common agenda in the first instance, this is the bringing together of agencies and people locally around a common understanding of not only what we want to achieve together, like the vision, but also what the problem is. Now, something to bear in mind with this is you will have a starting point with this, but over time, the understanding of the problem and therefore the required solutions will vary over time. But what is important is that as a group of stakeholders, there is always that kind of common thread that is binding everybody, because once that common thread starts to fall apart, people will start to dissipate away from the project. What we often find when we go into a place, there are multiple agencies working to solve different problems with different visions across a place. I would imagine there's a lot of people kind of nodding along to that at the moment. And actually in that is normally some very great work, but actually an inefficiency where different agencies are looking at the same children with different lenses and trying to solve slightly different problems that are a composite of the whole issue that needs to be overcome. So there's great efficiency in starting to bring people together with a common view of what is going wrong and how it might be solved. What this has meant in the Blackpool Literacy Project, from a problem perspective, it became very clear early on that there was some poor literacy development in the Key Stage 3 cohorts, and this was leading to poor attainment and progress at GCSE. Reading comprehension at the very beginning was focused on as a really major issue, and the data really bore that out very quickly. School staff, when we were looking at them, there was a limited knowledge of how to teach literacy across the place, and a limited ownership of literacy across the curriculum, which meant that there wasn't a consistent approach for this across the schools and the system in general. The reason they put in place as a group at the very beginning was to systematically improve the reading capability of 11 to 14-year-olds across Blackpool. Very exact, very focused, says exactly what they were all trying to achieve on the tin, and has been quite a powerful kind of calling for the group ever since. Now, to give you a sense of what that group looks like, when you start to bring together the stakeholders engaged in something like this, you actually end up with a rather large array of partners. Now, I won't go through this in too much detail, but in here are the commissioners, the funders, the measurement and evaluation partners, including GL assessment, us as the kind of program manager, and then intervention partners, the schools themselves, and the 3,811 to 14-year-olds that this project was initially focusing on. Keeping that in the air and everybody facing in the same direction is a huge challenge from a common agenda standpoint, but it's so pivotal if you're actually going to achieve scaled impact across a whole place. I wish it was simpler than this, but there isn't a single intervention partner out there to go to for all literacy issues. There isn't a single school teaching all of these children. So actually, you're always going to end up with a slightly difficult frame of partners that need to be bring together, and the whole thing needing to be held together at all times. Once you've got a common agenda, it then becomes a bit easier to start to think about what the shared measurement framework is. And this, for me, is the first really tough test of have you actually managed to bring together a common agenda? Because if you've brought together a common agenda, it should be relatively easy with some skilled partners to try and understand what the measures of that might be. So we would talk about the common agenda being only a dream until you manage to actually agree what the shared measurement framework looks like. What we find very often when we go to places is multiple agencies working to multiple statutory measurement frameworks, and the existing data is producing kind of little insight into the problems and solutions, and there's little sharing between the agencies. Everybody is essentially talking a slightly different language, and as a result, you can't really have the conversation you need to have about how you get the best for these young people. What this has meant in the Blackpool Literacy Project, the data has been completely transparent, shared between all of the partners very, very freely in a clearly non-attributable way from a child perspective. But the measures have included reading and literacy, so GL Assessment's new group reading test, the new group spelling test, dyslexia screener, and English progress tests. For school engagement, we've been looking at the attitude to self in school, again, another GL measure, attendance data, behaviour and exclusion data across the cohort as well. And the school staff development, we developed a questionnaire as a group with Alex Quigley and the Education Endowment Foundation. And I should say the research school in Blackpool have been sensational on that as well. And we've also been using Cure's closed case analysis approach to really start to look at how you understand case study to case study, school to school, what is going on around this. So that gives you a sense of the shared measurement framework that the schools have put together in this case. Then the bit that everybody focuses on, the mutually reinforcing activities, the what's, the interventions that you're kind of putting in place. This is about what is going to be required to deliver the vision. And there needs to be an understanding that there isn't going to be a uniform approach across the place. As a charity, we focus on communities in the bottom 10% for the indices of multiple deprivation. And actually, from place to place, we see very, very common needs. But actually, from place to place, you see a huge variation in the assets that are available. In some places, we're finding research schools and others not. In some places, quite incredible on the ground community literacy projects, in other places not. So you find very, very different assets from school to school, from place to place. And actually, what's really important is to understand that there isn't a common single approach that everybody should adopt in a place to deliver the same outcomes. So there then becomes a requirement of a coordination of differentiated activities that are happening across different partners within that place to deliver the same vision. What we often found in communities we go into is that there is a huge amount of activity going on across multiple agencies, but somehow that incredible amount of activity is not adding up to the desired outcomes. So the question with this is always, what do we put in, what do we take out that might start to add up to the vision that we're trying to deliver? The Blackpool Literacy Project itself, it's been looking very, very closely at very evidence-informed approaches to implementation. So EEF's implementation guidance has been the kind of key frame to that, led by the research school, and it provides a really, really strong frame. So I think if schools take one thing out of this today, I would go and look at the implementation guidance from the EEF on how to think about implementing intervention. And then there's been some very targeted interventions. The schools have been using the methodology called the response to intervention approach, which helps schools think about what is the universal offer, what is the more targeted offer to groups with moderate needs, and then what do individuals with high needs also get. Around this has been a huge amount of training and coaching, really building expertise and essentially craftsmanship in the quite incredible leads within this project. Each school had the ability to appoint up to 2 leads, one taking a lead from a senior management perspective on evidence-based practice, and the other being the literacy lead. Some schools have decided that that is one role and one person, and others have split it across 2. But those people have had some quite incredible training and coaching, and many of the staff delivering intervention below have had the same. So there's a real sense of a growing expertise across the Blackpool schools in the understanding and meeting of needs around literacy and reading in particular. And then there's a huge amount of monitoring and evaluation going on. Special mention in particular to GL Assessment, who have gone above and beyond in the amount of support that they've been able to give the place and the schools in both measuring various aspects, but also understanding the insight that's being delivered. This has been absolutely pivotal, and we're very, very grateful for that sheer amount of work that's gone in. Okay, moving on to continuous communication. This is a very important aspect, and what we often find is when you go into a place, there is little kind of meaningful horizontal communication between the multiple agencies, and there's little meaningful vertical communication between the multiple agencies and the communities they're serving. And as a result, things don't end up being as joined up as they possibly can. And the condition here is to try and create a real sense of a place where those involved in this project can communicate very freely. What this has meant for the Blackpool Literacy Project, I want to highlight something actually that Stephen Tierney did very, very early on as the chair of this project. Stephen, as you probably know, is one of the go-to people on social media and Twitter in particular around education, and had a phenomenal record in St Mary's as a head teacher in Blackpool. So, you know, when the new group turns up to start to put this project together, Stephen could have been quite an intimidating influence. But actually, he started this off brilliantly by talking to the group about not the successes that they've had along the way, but some of the failures they've had along the way, some of the things they've tried that haven't succeeded. And that actually set the group at ease very, very early on. And it's led to a really kind of great ethic amongst the group of being able to share failure from learning as much as from success. And that adds a huge amount of efficiency in terms of the learning of the group and the speed with which the group can move things forwards. So I just wanted to kind of highlight that as something that's very important. Within the whole project as a whole, we've talked about the evidence leads and the literacy leads. They meet every half term for a whole day as a group to go through training, steering the project and sharing, learning to that point. We at Right to Succeed meet with them 2 to 3 times a half term just to go through progress, help deal with little issues that are kind of coming up along the way. And as a group, they hold all the decisions on budget, intervention, and the approach made by the group as a group. They are incredibly supportive of each other, but they also hold each other to account on impact, and that's quite an amazing thing to see across a system. And the groups together are raising issues with local decision makers as they arise. You know, issues around actually how do we get great provision for children with really high needs around speech language communication and things like that are starting to be channeled through this group as a collective. They see this happening on a day-to-day basis, which is quite powerful. So that's the continuous communication point. And then in terms of the backbone support, this is something that is very normally ignored, but the backbone is essentially the coordination and the management of the project. Now, if you think back to that diagram and all of the partners involved in this, keeping that whole thing in the air and everybody pointing in the same direction at the same time actually requires a huge amount of effort. And the role of the backbone is to try and keep that whole thing together. The analogy that I'd use is essentially, if you imagine we're all trying to put on a film together, your director is your steering group and your local chair, in this case Stephen Tierney, who are really setting the direction, the direction of travel of the project. Your actors and your stars are those local agencies, those local professionals who are trying to drive change, the local young people as well. Actually, the role of the backbone organisation, which is the role we typically fulfil, is the role of the producer. the person that is essentially trying to bring the resource together, making sure everybody is together as a group in the right place at the right time, doing the right things. It's a relatively thankless task. There are no awards for being great producers, but actually it's such an essential part to keeping the whole show on the road. And what we often find is that this is very rarely prioritised. People are very happy to pay for the interventions, very often happy to pay for the measures as well, but actually the keeping the whole thing together and pointing in the same direction is rarely prioritised. What this has meant in the Blackpool Literacy Project, we have a programme director and programme officer who are supporting all of the partners and the schools involved in this the whole way through. The steering group is formed of the evidence leads and the literacy leads from the schools and chaired brilliantly by Stephen Cherney. And then the leads in each school are becoming the backbone within their own school, that are becoming incredibly knowledgeable about evidence-based practice, but also incredibly knowledgeable about how you deliver literacy outcomes for a cohort with low literacy capability. So that's what the backbone looks like. So those are the 5 conditions in brief that we are always trying to achieve. But I thought it'd be useful to actually share some of the key learning to date. So our key learnings as an organisation around effective place-based change, first of all, take time to get the common agenda and the measurement framework right from the beginning. Don't think that once you've done it, it stays there in static form. It will change over time. I mean, if you look at the literacy project, the initial focus when we were bidding and writing everything together was literacy. Very quickly that became focused on reading, and as they're starting to make very good progress on reading, they're starting to look at other aspects like speech language communication need. So over time that common agenda will evolve, but it's just really important that as a group, the whole group is evolving on that. Robust implementation has to be a non-negotiable. In the short term, I'd really recommend the EEF implementation guidance and talking to your local research school about how your staff might become proficient in this. I think it's a really core aspect of thinking about how you deliver effective change that then leads you on to the what, the intervention that's going to be required each time. And from school to school, it will be very different. There is no universal no universal kind of intervention set that you should be adopting to deliver change. There will be existing intervention that needs to be switched off or adapted to make space. Just be aware that as well as turning new things on, there is probably always a need to turn things off, which can sometimes be quite painful. Open, transparent communication, we talked about that, and Stephen's excellent example of kind of sharing failure as well as success. And that needs to be modelled very, very early on to make it a very easy thing to be able to do going forwards for the rest of the group. And learning comes first. Create an environment where learning as a group can be prioritised. That environment actually has to be quite a low stakes environment. I know that education has become a very high stakes environment over the last few years, but actually creating a place where people can be honest and can learn together is the thing that's really going to drive change. So that's me. I will hand over at this point, and thanks for listening.
Thank you very much, Graeme. Fantastic insights from you there. And yeah, we're very proud to be one of your partners along with the Blackpool schools in helping those young people's outcomes.
Thanks, Dan.
So, on to one of our other partners now, Whole Education. So I'm now going to pass over to Lisa Ling.
They'll be reflected in some of the practical work we're going to share that we've been doing across Bolton. As Darren said, my name's Lisa Ling, and I'm the Director of Secondary at Whole Education. Whole Education is a network organisation comprising of primary, secondary and special schools working across England. In my role, I also work with schools across locality teams, and I've got the privilege of working with Team Bolton, and you'll hear from 3 of the Team Bolton leads in the next sort of 5 or 6 minutes. The Bolton Learning Partnership, coordinated by the Executive Lead Tony Purcell, consists of 28 secondary settings across Bolton. Tony sends his apologies that he's not here himself today to discuss the Bolton Words for All programme, but he'd be happy to be connected if anybody wishes to find out any more following on from this presentation. Right, so over the course of the next half an hour and over the course of my 5 minutes, we are going to be attempting to give you a really high level flavour of the Collaborative Words for All programme, and hearing from what Graeme's just said about the theory of place-based change and how that's looking in practice across Bolton. So I know that many of you are on this webinar today because we're increasingly concerned about the language gap. We know that language opens doors, and without enough language, a young person is seriously limited in their success and enjoyment of school and beyond. And it's from this point that obviously Bolton, realising that this is a national challenge but also a collective priority for them, they believed that they needed to approach whole education for coming up with a collaborative solution. And this links back to what Graeme was just saying about this common agenda. In the past, I think it was fair to say that there had been many literacy initiatives, and whilst they were full of good intentions, they did in fact come and go, and that they had variable impact, and there was possibly a failure to have long-term gains and any sustainability from those initiatives. And where there were pockets of great success, and where there are pockets of great success in Bolton, it was really hard to easily share and replicate these either within schools or certainly from school to school. Therefore, Bolton wanted to resource a programme, and I may say with a very limited budget, that would enable long-term commitments to closing the language gap. And I think it is that long-term element that we'd also really want to stress. Therefore, they wanted to have help and add capacity to untap local expertise and best practice. And they wanted to make sure that that sort of passion to sort of diminish and decrease and close the language gap, and to have some real champions was harnessed, and that actually had some impact across Bolton. So collaboratively, we co-created a programme that would be impactful in the here and now, and also have sustainable change. And they recognised, as Graeme has already alluded to, that there needed to be a project management of that. They needed to add external capacity. They wanted to start small and build up, and it was very important that it was place-based and context-driven. So it was for Bolton, by Bolton, hence the sort of name words for Bolton, by Bolton on the initial slide. So one of the things that we wanted to do was we wanted to get together with a team of some very enthusiastic champion leaders from Bolton, alongside Whole Education and the Bolton Learning Partnership, and co-create a project with these embedded principles. So in the summer 2018, summer term 2018, we got together and sort of designed, I suppose, if you look, these 5 principles from which the project was going to grow and develop. It was very important that there was noticeable and early impact on students that then could be built on and cascaded. It was really important that local leaders were developed, and that we made sure that we started from a point of view where we got the most passionate and the most engaged, and then that was going to be cascaded throughout the 28 secondary settings. It was really important to Whole Education, so obviously one of our driving principles, but also to this particular project, that there was peer learning at the heart, and that this peer learning, sharing and support from real schools with real teachers and real students was going to be one of the key priorities for the project, for the programme. Of course, it needed to be rigorous, and this is obviously we have a partnership with GL, and I want to again echo what Graeme said. GL have been absolutely amazing in providing support, and sort of we have lent upon the NGRT, the new group reading test, as a way to have rigorous and high quality evaluation of the project, and that's an integrated part of all that we do. And that we believe that this will lead to system-led and sustainable school improvement over time. So I'm just going to flick on to the next slide. You are going to hear from Alison from Smithills, Claire from Harper Green, and Carolyn from St Joseph's, and they're going to go into more detail, but we're delighted by the sort of early 18-month signs of impact on the students so far. As I've said before, it is fundamental that this brings about some system change, and you can see from here there are some key impact measures that again are showing great signs of sort of early success. We've increased the numbers of schools, the continuous year-on-year improvement built into the programme, so schools continue to improve. It's building the leadership capacity, The system change model can be transferable to other priorities. So alongside the language deficit, we're learning about sort of a system change model that can be applied to other priorities in Bolton. Obviously, it's embedded external expertise is within it as well. And we also believe that obviously we're in these unprecedented times of sort of partial schools opening, etc. And we think that this will be COVID-19 proof, if you can say such a thing, that we'll be able to pick up and regain momentum because of the way that the programme has been designed. So what is the programme? So here in my last minute is the programme design and support. You can see that it's built on, again, Graeme talked about having sort of regular touch points. There is a launch for the programme at the start of every year for heads and for programme leads, but then there are built-in half-termly touch points. There's lots of coaching embedded into the model by either expert coaches like David Crossley, who's an international lead in sustainable school improvement, but also very important peer coaching. We've also worked with Alex Quigley launched this year. We've got Mary, Marta and Alex are both very instrumental in making sure that we've got that expert input. And of course, again, going to the NGRT so that we've got some evaluation throughout the project, but also evaluation at the end point of every year. So without further ado, because I know you want to hear of what this actually looks like on a school and across school level, I'm going to hand over to our first contributor from Bolton, and Alison, to share the impact of Words for All in Smiths.
Thank you, Lisa. So I'm Alison Cowan. I'm Assistant Vice Principal at Smiths, and this is the third year that I've done something similar in a different setting, the third school I've been in. The reason I've put down the areas I am a strategic line manage for are purely to show you that I have a strategic overview that's required. So rather than all these different areas doing some great independent work, it was my role which enables me to bring together the strategic view to provide a consistent approach to the teaching of vocabulary. We all know that funding has been reduced, and this Bolton collaborative approach helps to minimise the traditional solutions of external CPD, which can often be expensive. It's with students more on social media, they lose the ability to communicate in a way that matches the cultural habitus of the schooling system, which creates more issues for us when we're actually at the coalface. The change in landscape of the curriculum over the last few years has been phenomenal, and with the demand of the linear GCSEs, reading ages on some of these science and citizenship exams are in excess of 16 years plus, and quite often it teaches the theory without real accessible strategies within the schools in order to maintain this system change. With demand for accelerated progress further and further to close those gaps when students come in from Key Stage 2, the traditional packages and programmes often promise the earth, are very expensive and too generic sometimes for what we actually need within our schools. And so for me, it has little sustained impact. So what is the intervention that I'm actually talking about? Well, it's oracy, reading and language skills, and it's focused on academic vocabulary. Traditionally, students have come off non-core subjects, which can lead to disengagement. They'd come out of lessons maybe once or twice a week for their literacy intervention, and there'll be little noticeable impact both for students and staff. So quite often you get students not wanting to go, skiving from these lessons. So I decided to flip it. I did receive a lot of staff saying to me, this isn't going to work. So students, after staff and student surveys, I decided to run an intervention where students will come off timetable for English, geography and history for a 6-week block. This would mean that they'd miss a whole topic of learning rather than the odd lesson, which would be easier for staff to maintain and understand what their students needed to learn. The missed learning would be addressed within the intervention during the vocabulary and the oracy elements. The core element would be a direct instruction programme that I've bought from McGraw and Hill, which has been absolutely superb. And this would occur, that direct instruction would occur every single day as a daily minimum of expectation. Sometimes it would be twice a day, and obviously this would help to accelerate that progress that we need above and beyond the traditional progress that's made. It would address the core skills for reading, comprehension at both word, sentence and paragraph level. Other elements included oracy and class discussion, which culminated in a traditional tea party celebration on a Friday. Now, this was absolutely crucial for the buy-in of students, and it sounds really minor, but we'd have teacups, it would help socialisation, there would be pots of tea, hot chocolate, small sandwiches, whatever the students wanted. But what that teacher was actually doing, she was assessing what they'd learned throughout the week and their ability to put it into a social situation. And what it did mean is that when word got around, more and more students wanted to join in, and it helped with that student buy-in, which traditionally we struggled with an awful lot. It also allowed students to practice the learned skills whilst retaining understanding of the topics that they'd missed. And obviously there's a range of other resources that we used as well during this period of time. Why do we need this particular intervention at Smithills? We have a particularly high proportion of Year 7 entering school with significantly lower than average reading and spelling levels. We needed specific needs for very identified cohorts such as white British boys and girls, reluctant readers, INA, and a high proportion of EAL students. We had a huge intervention timetable of approximately, I think it was 200 students across 2 weeks being seen for maybe 1 or 2 hours. And whilst progress was being made, it wasn't accelerated enough, which didn't sustain students' interest in that. And quite often they wouldn't want to go. Staff were struggling to see and have clear communication and what those students were actually learning as well. And ultimately, we need to develop a culture of a love of learning through an intensive programme to facilitate the learning that they would have across their whole curriculum. The implementation of this was, it took a little time. We had to pitch the idea to SLT and explain the rationale. We needed to obviously evaluate our current intervention through data, but student and staff voice actually was pertinent in order to get the buy-in of students to understand what they needed, and so staff it told me what they didn't like about the current system and what they would like to see. So I moulded what was going on for this particular intervention around both student and staff need. We rearranged the intervention timetable to allow for staff redeployment. This minimised the costs, and actually the biggest cost was just the direct instruction programme. So we used our current staff. The key to any intervention programme over the years that I've been doing this is to identify the appropriate students. If you don't get the students right, then you'll have a myriad of students in one intervention and one size does not fit all. So it's about targeting it specifically. So we identified the appropriate students. We decided we were going to go with Year 7 for INA language acquisition because other students who had low literacy received catch-up and other forms of funding. We did a pilot for Year 8 for pure literacy support, and we did Year 9 for literacy support in class just before they were the lowest. I think they were set 4 just before they went into GCSEs. We prioritised students who were pupil premium. We had prioritised students with reading ages significantly below their own reading age, but with no SEN requirement. That's something we later pilot on as a SEN group in order to make sure that needs matched. They were also in receipt of other intervention, and quite often traditionally what we'd found is it was the same students getting 5 or 6 interventions and we weren't using them as effectively as we could. We informed the key staff that they'd missed their subjects for 6 weeks, obviously except the Year 9 class who were being taught during their lesson, and we ensured they gave us topics that they were going to miss of keywords that the students needed to know, key concepts, key ideas, and they would be taught during the oracy session, so students wouldn't miss out on the whole 6 weeks of a scheme of learning. And we carried out our baselines with the NGRT, which has proved absolutely valuable. We originally did it in my very first school on paper, and that was because it was a very small pilot, and we have since moved to testing all our Year 7s as a result of working collaboratively with Bolton. The impact, as you can see, I'm not going to read it all out. Year 7, this was the INA intensive. The students showed a reading age in their 6 weeks, anywhere from 2 months up to 1 year and 6 months. This is absolutely phenomenal. It was exactly what we needed for that accelerated progress. Following analysis shows that students have maintained their improvement. Year 8, which was the low level literacy students, they showed in 6 weeks anywhere from 5 months up to 2 years and 10 months. And this is significant, as the average gain quite often in an intervention programme is only 3 months in reading age across the 12 weeks. Following analysis also shows that students have maintained their improvement. And the final group was measured slightly differently, and it was the pilot for the Year 9 literacy within lesson. And what this staff member did, they measured fluency against errors. And as you can see, one student increased from 15 words per minute up to 62 words per minute, whilst decreasing their errors by 50%. This is really important because, especially when they're going into studying GCSE across literature, the errors, students get very cross when they make errors and don't read fluently because they lose the meaning of what they're reading. And obviously, on the literature books, it's very difficult for students to engage their interest. So this was interesting and very successful. You see the hard data, that clearly speaks for itself across 6 weeks. The soft data was just as important for me. 100% of staff preferred this form of intervention because they said they knew exactly where the students were going to be. They knew they were missing the 6 weeks, and they knew they were also getting the work back after the 6 weeks of what had been done across those intervention hours, and they liked the fact they got the work back, so they had the evidence in the exercise books. 100% of students preferred this style of intervention, saying they felt they could understand their lessons, they enjoyed reading and talking to each other, they liked the oracy side of it, and they actually felt they were improving because it was in such a condensed block of 6 weeks, and they felt that when they went back into their traditional lessons, that actually they could see the benefit as opposed to it being a little bit more drip fed. The intervention has maintained this impact at similar levels for subsequent groups because we have now got one for our nurture group moving forward, and they've also maintained their impact. The next steps is to embed the structure of direct instruction across a whole range of, and open it up to a whole range of students, pilot the direct instruction for numeracy, and pilot the structure for our nurture group, which is SEN and SEMH. Obviously, the results won't necessarily reflect maybe 6 years improvement, but it will reflect improvement at the level that they're learning at. So it all has to be in the priority of the students that you're choosing. Reflection. As Lisa mentioned earlier, this collaborative approach has focused my vision into how we can sustain and improve student outcomes and what our next steps will be. So reflection for me is, how can we sustain this across the curriculum? It needs to have a whole school strategy. We need to change the culture in our school, is what it's actually made me realise, whereas a literate one where pupils are talking appropriately, using appropriate vocabulary to express themselves within different contexts, and reading far more widely. The action so far, we've introduced Words of the Week, which was initially led by myself, but now it's been adapted for subjects to do their own. Students evidence specific words within their classwork, within their speech, staff and peers, and there's rewards. This has since moved on. We've delivered whole school CPD to upskill staff on the importance of using reading ages appropriately to match task to student, a recap of Key Stage 2 scores and what that actually means in students' ability to access our curriculum and how it transfers to high school. And moving further forward, we need to also consider, it's for us as a school, it's not just about our low literacy levels or our INA or EL pupils, it's also about considering the literacy of the most able, and quite often they still have some literacy gaps. We assume they have this high level vocabulary, and quite often they have some but not access to all of it. So it's making sure we don't make assumptions and we're pushing them up at every specific identified group. There are SPAG reminders as well, and visual reminders of what we expect with exam command keywords, etc. The focus for us now is, moving forward as a school, is to change the culture, our literate culture. We need to raise the profile of the library with greater cross-curricular usage, rather than it just being driven through English, which is traditionally, I think, what a lot of schools fall back on. Greater displays around the school rather than just in the English teaching space. We've created a branding in line with the literacy to engage Key Stage 3 initially, running competitions, assemblies, etc., designing logos. We're developing appropriate resources for Key Stage 4 with the introduction of exam support booklets for command words to make explicit the cross-curricular links and thereby the importance of them reading widely, to contextualise their reading and their learning and its importance. We've also linked it into our reward system for Smithles Challenge for each year group. And this really sums it up for me. The idea is when we do our year 7, our intensive, they come in to do the intensive, so they're high school ready for their students that don't have 100 when they join us. Year 8 is an intensive group to recap, to sustain that learning. And year 9 would just be skills. And then by the time you get to Key Stage 4, you've got just pure SEND access in their curriculum. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alison. That's really great to see all the work you've been doing there. And we're now going to move over to Carolyn from St Joseph's.
To share with you the impact I've made improving the provision of literacy across the curriculum in my role as literacy lead at St Joseph's. Firstly, I'd like to outline the intent behind the strategies I've implemented and then demonstrate the impact that these have had within our school. The forming of Words for All came at a critical time for us at St Joseph's. We knew that if we were to really make a difference, not only to improving outcomes, but also the life chances of our students, we'd need to work collaboratively with other schools within the borough. Our whole school priorities have been to secure a Progress 8 score in line with or above national average. We need to target priority students to ensure we narrow the attainment gap of our disadvantaged students, as well as further stretch our higher prioritizing boys who statistically do not achieve as well as girls. Therefore, to support these aims, I devised an intent to relaunch literacy and to create measurable gains with these 2 discrete groups. From a personal point of view, literacy has always been a passion of mine. I entered teaching to remove the barriers to learning, strive for academic excellence for all, and I personally wanted to be part of a programme purposely set out to raise aspirations of all students, encourage learning to flourish and change the lives of young people across our local authority. And by reaching out to join like-minded individuals and colleagues in other Bolton schools, I felt this could be a real chance to make sustainable change. I intended to use literacy as a vehicle to allow our students to access all areas of our curriculum, to contextualise their learning and to be able to not only just realise their full potential, but even achieve or even surpass it. Closing the vocabulary gap and improving student outcomes in written components would be key areas for us to address to work towards our whole school aim. So first, it was essential to gain support from staff, and this was a difficult task to achieve when many teachers viewed literacy as an English teacher's responsibility. I set out, therefore, to visualise the advantages of literacy for staff and to grow its presence across the school. The growing presence of literacy through form time challenges, Word of the Week, World Book Day activities, and a literacy mentor scheme allowed me to slowly promote the importance of literacy in the eyes of staff. Many staff commented on how I'd inspired and enlightened them during CPD training, and I used interactive sessions that showed them exactly how it affected their subject areas, and this helped to build a consistent and holistic approach to teaching literacy. I devised bespoke strategies for subject areas to assist in improving outcomes, particularly in vocational subjects where written elements of the exam are proving a challenge for pupils. Under the new GCSE specifications, written components increased significantly to at least 50% weighting. So when I explored the historical data, it was clear students had a practical proficiency, but major gains were to be made in written elements where there were key areas of weaknesses. I also created a toolkit of strategies for staff to embed within schemes of learning, encouraging staff to focus on explicit vocabulary teaching to enhance their understanding and comprehension of examination terminology. Without the foundation of understanding brought about through reading comprehension, students would be without the skills to contextualise their learning and to articulate their ideas with fluency and confidence. These are essential skills needed to master the final exams and to flourish in the wider world of work. Simplifying exam terminology has made a significant impact in improving comprehension. Understanding the term is the first step to understanding the skill needed to be utilised by the student. Seeing how colleagues in other schools across Bolton had begun to address this issue, we adapted an initiative first seen at Smithills. So thank you, Alison, for that. The exam terminology posters that have been created have been promoted on wall displays, planners, books, classrooms, been referred to in lessons, and we continue to utilise this idea to create bespoke resources for subject areas, such as model answer prompt cards. Vocational subjects with heavily weighted written components have found these particularly useful, such as PE. Now at St Joseph's, PE was a subject that had seen a poor trend in outcomes, and therefore that became a key area for me to target. The impact of my resources and the training and the support that I gave to PE staff began to quite quickly be seen in pupil outcomes. Their written components, as you can see, were becoming more fluent, a lot clearer and more coherent. The impact of my intervention was also clearly evident in the data for the whole cohort that we targeted. As you can see, noticeable gains were made with our priority groups. With work continuing with PE into year 2 of the project, we estimate further gains were to be made towards a positive progress 8 by year 11. So that was year 1 of the project. Moving into year 2, I estimated similar gains would hopefully be made in design technology, ICT and drama, as these were areas where I began to also work with leaders. These were subjects where students again demonstrated a practical proficiency but weaknesses in written components. So from September this academic year, I worked closely with leaders in these areas to build and embed literacy strategies into their curriculum areas, and this would hopefully have a similar impact that to the one already made in PE. When we utilise CPD time, we use it to create staff groups or triads where staff could share good practice and support one another. And this obviously helped to build a more consistent approach to teaching literacy across school. However, the focus on vocabulary and writing has now begun to shift to address the reading gap. GL has been instrumental in allowing us to see the need for this provision. Using the new group reading tests, that delivered results which highlighted the need for 2 different sets of intervention. So decoding issues in higher ability students were being masked by their ability to comprehend larger passages of text. And when we cross-referenced the NGRT results with in-school data, we saw these students often found word problems, particularly in maths, were an issue. Other students could decode very well, but reading comprehension was an issue highlighted in the NGRTs as well. This would limit outcomes in subjects that are largely text-based, like humanities. So therefore, GL assessment has been fundamental in helping us to evaluate our literacy provision at St Joseph's, and we intend to now move to addressing the reading gap in year 2 and year 3 of our project. Being part of the Words for All project has taught me that if you want to make sustainable change that delivers tangible impact, you need to be prepared for a long journey. There's been positive change at St Joseph's, but we still have many obstacles to overcome to achieve our mission. It's impossible to work with all subject leaders in all subject areas at once, but I've created momentum whereby staff are working more collaboratively to address the issues that we all face, ensuring our students have the best foundation for lifelong learning and therefore better life chances. It also wouldn't have been possible without the support of colleagues in other Bolton schools within, obviously within the borough. The collaborative opportunities this project has provided me have really been the crux of our success. So that's me, and I will hand over to Claire from Harper Green.
Hello, hi. Yeah, I'm Claire Doherty from Harper Green School. My project is actually quite different to the 2 that you've already had described to you. I work in a school, as many of us do, where the literacy levels at entry are very, very low. So our intent was to increase reading for pleasure in order to counter the very low literacy levels on entry. I put pleasure in inverted commas there because I recognise and accept that the vast majority of children do not see reading as pleasure anymore. When I arrived at the school, I came as head of English, and the head teacher at the time said to me to not get used to having a beautiful library, which we did have at the time, because he was decided to get rid of the books and put computers in there. So I begged him to give me a year and let me prove to him that children do read, because it was his great belief that children don't read. So I began a library project to try to get children to read, which of course is a massive task to take on. And then of course we hope for all the benefits that come along with reading, you know, the improvements in vocabulary and background knowledge, in empathy and mental and emotional well-being. And, you know, then of course the idea of being better at reading in terms of comprehension. So initially we looked at the library lessons, which were horrific and mostly just consisted of children running around bookshelves and looking at the pictures in the Guinness World Book of Records. So we decided that in order to make this a sort of useful time and that children were actually reading, we needed to make this reading accountable. Now, years ago, I set up an event called the Big Book Quiz, which, looking at the delegates list of this group, there are some staff actually on that delegates list who started this journey with me running the Big Book Quiz event, which was a Teams event for schools. So we decided to develop that into a book. So the book, there's now a book of quizzes that they, in the library lessons, they use. And it's very, very low tech. I wanted to move away from the technology. Obviously, there are other reading quizzes available out there, but they are on screen, high tech. And I wanted to move to everything low tech. No reading on screen, no quizzes on screen, because actually it was the excitement of using the computer that seemed to take over. So we introduced this. We took the computers out of the library, actually, and made it just a reading space. So they then, you know, sat with, and we could actually account for the fact that they were reading because they were completing the quizzes as they went along in their book. The impact of that was huge. We had a significant increase in library borrowing. In fact, some months the borrowing was over 1,000 books in one year group. And, you know, their awareness of children's literature, we had fewer copies of Diary of a Wimpy Kid type books being taken out of the library, and then our reading data demonstrates that, you know, we've got a huge number of books being actually read independently, and we can see that from their answers in the quiz book. And then, of course, the knock-on of that is a rise in reading ages, which we could see. On joining the Words for All group, David Crossley asked me a very pertinent question. He asked me, how do you get them to buy in? And my answer, sort of as I started to give that answer, taught me what I needed to do next. And I sort of said, well, I just make them do it. I just tell them they have to. And of course, that's not good enough, because that's not going to create that buy-in. So the next thing we needed to do was a real big shift on culture. And it was joining the Words for All group and that sort of sharing and reflecting on what we'd done that sort of created that shift. So we went to pulling year groups out of curriculum time to do reading assemblies. We introduced a book of the month, which we displayed up around school everywhere. We linked it to our reward system where they got points for being engaged with reading. We had a targeted reading group of white British boys. And basically we poster flooded the school with what staff were reading, competition boards, photographs of children reading. And, you know, when I say flood the school, of course, everybody fights for display space on the corridors, and I just think we just became the loudest voice out there on the corridors. So the school culture has shifted massively, and then, you know, thanks to GL assessments, we've been able to really closely monitor that. So monitoring the reading ages, targeting our intervention equals a very happy head teacher. I think Alison mentioned before the idea of hard and soft data. A lot of my data up until this point has been very soft data, very cultural. You know, my idea of a school with a reading culture is where children are talking about reading, where you can ask a child on the corridor what they're reading and they've got an answer for you. And at Harper Green, we've now very definitely got that. And then the last sort of part was then I, as well as Alison and Carolyn, became coaches for the other schools, at which point we were sort of sharing, listening and supporting them. We shared our ideas and pitfalls. We meet them regularly to keep on track. We we encourage them to attend meetings. We provide that sort of link in between the meetings. And then it's a fantastic way of creating local links with things like events like the Big Book Quiz, which still runs mostly in the Northwest, to be honest. But we've still got teams entering every year, and it goes up every year. And so we're creating a real cultural shift in Bolton and in the Northwest by doing it. And of course now we've sort of tracked and monitored all of our year 7s using GL assessments, and we can now provide our head teacher with some of that harder data that of course all head teachers really enjoy. Okay, thank you. I'll now hand back.
Thank you very much indeed, Claire, and thanks everyone. That's been some fantastic insights, not just at school level but place-based as well. We are at 12 o'clock now. We are just going to take a few questions. Understand if people do need to leave, the questions will be on the recording. Just going to ask about 3 questions. So we've got one here. This is particularly directed for Graeme. Have parents and carers been involved at all, bearing in mind reading habits at home are a major factor?
Yes, and as you can imagine, different schools have taken different approaches, but yes, and there is also an opportunity area sponsored project starting to look at the community aspect of this with the National Literacy Trust, looking at families in particular. So hopefully between these aspects that will start to get covered. But yes, the culture of reading at home is of course where all of these issues come from in the first place. So it's an urgent issue to be dealt with.
Thanks, Graeme. There's one for Alison here. How can we support second language learners whose primary reason for verbal deficit is adverse mother tongue intervention?
Well, I've actually created an INA direct intervention group, intensive group as well. Obviously, they use the programme that's slightly lower, and it's built slightly differently because we are much more aware of their social and emotional needs. And I was just responding to some questions who asked what INA actually means, and it's in-year arrivals, often students who are refugees, displaced with little or no grasp of the English language. We have a high proportion of students, and I actually created intensive for them as well. And more often than not, they do slightly more hours per week than the low-level literacy in year 8.
Great, thank you. One for Carolyn here. What CPD did you do with staff that inspired them?
It was very much an interactive session, so it was visualising why literacy is really important. So it was looking at statistics very much about the reading gap within particular subjects and how that would affect outcomes in different subject areas. And it, rather than just showing slides and talking and lecturing staff, it was very much using interactive sessions. So by quizzes and showing real examples of students' work where we've had impact, so that they can visually see why addressing literacy in each subject area is important, rather than just telling them. And I think that was an absolute crux to getting staff on board, so they could visually see, yes, that's made a difference and I need to make that difference in my subject area.
Okay. And there's a question for Claire here. How are you going to embed the reading culture and protect it so that the focus is not lost when another initiative is introduced?
Yeah, good question. I think actually I've introduced a number of other initiatives myself, and I do think it's about trying to maintain yourself as the loudest voice. I think there's a big selling job that needs doing, especially on a head teacher. My head teacher is a mathematician, but is incredibly sympathetic and sort of totally on board with the idea that children need to read. So I think you really need to sell the idea and make it stick. And I think that obviously new initiatives come along sort of very, very regularly, and each year has a new focus. But this one, this idea of a library and a reading culture is sort of, in a way, is quite a simplistic thing. And so we managed to keep it going by continuing to flood the school and continuing to convince the head teacher that it's the right way to do it, and that's always worked for us, to be honest.
Thank you very much indeed. Well, that's the key questions that we've had through. Try to cover everyone there. That is the end of the webinar today. I'd love to thank you for attending today. I'd like to thank Graeme, Lisa, Alison, Carolyn and Claire for their time. It's been so informative, and we hope that people can take something away from this to help in their settings.